Welcome to the Brain People Podcast, a show where four mental health experts team up to bring you practical tools for overcoming mental health challenges. The Brain People don't replace your doctor or therapist, but we will give you some extra tools to help you on your journey. So join us as we fight mental illness, one episode at a time. Welcome to the Brain People Podcast. I'm your host, and today I am joined by my co-host,
Jonathan Edens.
And Jonathan is a psychiatric PA, and I'm a psychiatrist. And today we're going to be talking about the topic of melatonin and whether or not you should be supplementing with melatonin. So we're going to go through a lot of really important, good information, and I hope it really helps you to make good decisions regarding how you can adequately produce melatonin and whether you should supplement. But first, I do need to mention the medical disclaimer, which is this podcast is only for informational purposes. You should not make any big health decisions based on this podcast. In fact, any health-related decisions, we encourage you to make under the guidance of your personal healthcare provider. All right, so Jonathan, let's dive right into the topic. Let's talk about melatonin. So what is melatonin?
Well, melatonin is more than a supplement, right? Most people are familiar with what you can buy over the counter, right? But it's actually a hormone that is naturally produced within the body. Its more scientific name is N-acetyl-5-methoxytryptamine. So that's for the science nerds out there that want to know that. But it's produced by a small little gland in basically the middle of the brain. So it's between the right and the left hemisphere, kind of deep within the brain, and it's called the pineal gland. And the function of the pineal gland is actually primarily to help to regulate the sleep-wake cycle by producing this hormone that we call melatonin. And so melatonin is, we'll say its primary function is to help with the circadian rhythm, but it actually has numerous roles, which we'll dive into. But it's a very interesting molecule, and so any questions so far?
No, maybe just more of a comment of something that I was reading here regarding melatonin and how it actually induces sleep, because that was a question that came up for me. I was like, okay, I know it helps regulate circadian rhythm, but it's interesting how there is actually a very direct effect of melatonin on the kind of the body's master clock. And so the master clock is in the hypothalamus of the brain, and it's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and that really that affects circadian rhythm. And so basically, when melatonin binds to the melatonin receptors in the brain, and from what I understand, is that it actually lowers the firing in the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus, and that in turn reduces alertness, and so then it in turn induces sleep. So I think it's pretty neat how that melatonin from the pineal gland then interacts directly with those receptors in the hypothalamus, and that's how it actually induces sleep.
So Dr. Binus, you used a phrase a couple times there, and I want to make sure that our listeners understand the terms that we're using. You mentioned circadian rhythm a couple of times. Would you be willing to define that for our listeners?
Sure. So basically, circadian comes from the Latin circa and dia, which has to do basically with our natural body rhythm throughout the day, and so when we have proper melatonin secretion at the right time, this helps then to regulate that, now is time for me to feel sleepy. And so over time, especially when we get into similar rhythms, then our body gets used to feeling hungry at certain times, or used to sleeping at certain times, or used to working at certain times. And so the more consistent we can be with that daily rhythm, and the more that we're exposed to the right kind of what's called Zeitgebers, in other words, like certain external stimuli, like sunlight, for example, this helps to set our natural body's clock so that our body can be in sync and know what it's supposed to be focused on doing at that time. So basically, it's the body's natural rhythm that occurs throughout the day.
Thank you for that excellent definition. A couple things I wanted to note about melatonin as we're kind of talking about what it is that it's actually very closely related to another hormone neurotransmitter that we talk about a lot on this podcast, and that is serotonin. There's actually only a couple slight structural differences between the two, and there's kind of a quick conversion that can be done between serotonin and melatonin. So they are often in synergistic or synchronized in sort of a way, and so it's important to note, that serotonergic medications or supplements and melatonin supplementation can actually affect, your serotonin system as well.
No, I was just going to ask, what do you think, how's that potentially related then to the importance of getting enough tryptophan if it is the building block, like in your diet, for example?
I think it is a requirement of sorts, right? If you have a tryptophan deficient diet, then we know the downstream effects of that are going to likely be deficiencies in the various, different biological products that come, as a result of that. And so, most people are likely getting, enough tryptophan. There's going to be tryptophan in a variety of different foods that we consume. Being an amino acid, it comes from protein-rich foods, right? And so there's going to be certain basically ratios of tryptophan depending on the food that you eat. But I think for most people, that's not really going to be an issue. I believe there are genetic abnormalities in which some people can't necessarily produce certain or can't convert certain things from their diet. That's probably a little too far from my knowledge, but it is an interesting conversation nonetheless. One thing I did want to touch on though is that melatonin production and secretion is not stagnant throughout the course of people's life. It actually has quite an interesting curve, if you will, in that it actually peaks shortly before or around the time of puberty, and then really kind of sharply starts to decline. And by the time you get into older age, is actually really, really low. I also, on the other end of the spectrum, most people that have had a child, know that they don't necessarily sleep with a circadian rhythm of sorts, right? They kind of have their own rhythm, and that's in part because they don't really produce melatonin when they're first born. It takes a while for that system to start to kick in, and they also have other sort of sleep drives that kind of that are stronger than the melatonin drive that they slowly begin to produce. It's kind of an interesting factoid because we'll talk about all the benefits that come with melatonin, and as you age and that begins to decline, why for some people it's important to really optimize melatonin naturally, as well as potentially for some people when it comes to supplementation.
One comment I'll make there is that totally makes sense because, I remember when our kids were first born, yeah, they would be waking up all the time. And now, once they hit, at least for us, 2, and then especially like 3 and 4 years old, they start sleeping a lot more solid through the night. And now, my 8-year-old boy, I can pick him up and walk around the house with him and, and while he's sleeping, and he won't wake up for anything, right? And I think it's because his melatonin levels are probably super high. And it took, our youngest, she's 4 now, but now I've seen a significant change, in her sleep patterns here over the last year and a half or so, where she's really like sleeping a lot more solidly. And again, to your point, I think that melatonin secretion, we're really seeing that rise sharply as she gets a little older.
So there's some secondary effects of roles, I should say, of the pineal gland as well as melatonin, and one of them is actually involved in the reproductive hormones, which I thought was pretty interesting. And it does make sense as to why, you see that sort of sharp rise and then it kind of peaks around the time of puberty and starts to really drop off. But it's the kind of prime, at least in part, and I'm not saying that this is, the entirety of the picture, but at least it's part of the picture, and that it helps with the modulation of hormones like follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which are part of regulating the functions of the ovaries, the ovaries and the testes. So that was something that I wasn't particularly familiar with, and so in prepping for this podcast, I thought that was fairly interesting.
Yeah, that is really interesting, and it actually even reminds me too that melatonin it inhibits the production of kisleptin, which is important in stimulating the onset of puberty, and so it's kind of interesting, when you actually don't have the enough melatonin, that could actually cause puberty to occur earlier, because then more of that kisleptin is produced or activated, and this is an issue I think that we're seeing with. I think we're going to get into this a little later, but certain things that can reduce the secretion or production of melatonin, and that in turn can, of course, make puberty happen earlier, which you don't want to happen. It's not a good thing.
So one other thing I wanted to mention about the effect of melatonin on sleep. So it is primarily driven, I think most of our listeners will probably know this, but it's primarily driven by exposure to light, right? And so melatonin secretion is going to mostly occur in the evenings, as the sun is going down, as the sun is setting, the color basically the color of light that we're exposed to begins to shift more towards reddish light, and then obviously it gets dark. And so our the photoreceptors in our eyes adjust and begin to basically produce and secrete this melatonin in response to essentially what we see, right, or what we don't see. For people where, say, they have an abnormal sleep schedule, say, such as night shift workers, this can be a very significant problem because you're being exposed to artificial light during the nighttime and you're sleeping during the daytime, right? And so it can really throw off your natural circadian rhythm. But more on that in a few minutes. I want to talk about some of the secondary roles of melatonin, because melatonin is not just a hormone that helps to regulate sleep. There's actually quite a few other things that it does. So, for example, some of the things that it can do, it's a potent antioxidant, and maybe one of the most potent that we're familiar with. Now, what this essentially means is that there's all sorts of free radical damage and oxidative damage that's going on in our body all the time, and so having melatonin really helps to reduce the downstream sort of problematic effects, such as certain diseases and age-related processes that occur. Melatonin may also help to modulate immune function. So another very sort of helpful anti-inflammatory property of this particular hormone. As you mentioned, it's also useful for other biological rhythms, and this would include things like seasonal rhythms. So for other animals that are involved in migration or hibernation, right, it plays a role in that. There's also certain digestive system rhythms, such as basically motility, meaning the sort of the movement of things through the digestive system, the secretion, aka the releasing of certain compounds in our digestive tract, and then also protection of the gut lining. And then another one that I thought was interesting, but there's some evidence to suggest that melatonin is involved in cardiovascular rhythms. So this would include things like how blood pressure changes throughout the day, things like heart rate variability, right? Our heart rate is not stagnant, and even between each beat, there's slight changes, and many people consider the difference or the variance between your heartbeats as actually a measure of good health, and then vascular function as well. So that I thought those were pretty interesting. And the last secondary role that I'll mention is on mood. And I mentioned that just a few minutes ago about serotonin and how those are kind of inextricably linked. So I think it's understandable to our listeners that having dysregulated melatonin, having and potentially being linked with dysregulated serotonin, that can lead to kind of a host of mental health disorders. Obviously, insomnia being a big one. That one's pretty clear. But there's a number of studies suggesting a strong link between melatonin and depression. And then we also see it being a problem for those with like seasonal affective disorder, or SAD, as we call it sometimes. And even in bipolar disorder, there's evidence to suggest that melatonin dysregulation can be problematic for those that deal with that as well.
When you mentioned the strong link between the melatonin and the depression, were you referring to more that there's not enough melatonin being secreted, or that it can go either way, kind of dysregulation?
Yeah, so primarily what the studies that I've seen looked at was actually with night shift workers. So most often what you see is in these studies that they're studying nurses. All right, so people that are doing 12-hour shifts, typically speaking, 8 to 12-hour shifts, we'll say, and many of them, I used to be a CNA and I worked the night shift. I did it for a year, and many of those nurses they had been doing this for years on end, and that was their normal weekly routine was to stay awake at night and then to sleep during the day. And so they didn't switch back and forth like I did. I usually would do 3 on, 4 off, and then that was a mess in and of itself. But for many of these nurses, they just adjusted to living their normal day during the night when everybody else was asleep, even on days that they weren't working. And so it creates an interesting population where we can really sort of hone in on, how melatonin can play a role with a variety of different conditions. And the 2 studies that I looked at, one of them was a meta-analysis looking at 11 observational studies of night shift workers, and the association with depression was the relative risk. The odds ratio, as we sometimes call it, was 1.43, essentially meaning that there was a 43% increase in depression for those that worked night shift relative to the nurses that worked during the day shift. So that was one meta-analysis of, like I said, 11 different studies. Now, these were observational studies, like I said, so it's not the best type of evidence, but it is something. And then there was another one where it was 7 longitudinal studies with over 28,000 participants, also shift workers, and they saw just overall risk of adverse mental health outcomes to be 28% greater in those that worked night shift. And so, one thing I will say about that particular analysis is that women seem to be at a much higher risk than men. Now, we know women just in general are at a much higher risk of depression and most mental health disorders when compared to men. But I think it was about a 73% increase for female night shift workers than male night shift workers.
Wow. Yeah. It's amazing to me that one little molecule would have such a huge role, on so many facets of our physical and mental health, for that matter. And it just goes to show how important melatonin, this topic is, the melatonin regulation and making sure that we have the adequate production at the right time, right? And so that leads me to my next question, which is, how do we really optimize melatonin production and secretion, would you say?
So there's a lot of different ways, and some of these are going to be basically things that we've said in the past about other topics, not necessarily emphasizing melatonin per se. But sometimes I do feel like we might be a little bit of a broken record to our listeners because we, essentially the same recommendations kind of come up over and over again. But the reason being because they're important and they're time tested and they work. So number 1 is maintaining a consistent sleep schedule as much as you can. And if you have to be a night shift worker, like it is better to to have a consistent sleep schedule, then it would be, and you'll have to take extra steps in order to adapt to kind of your situation to make it as optimal for you as you can. But if you are working, but especially if you are working kind of a normal day shift, right? Or you have where you're awake during the day and asleep during night. It's best if you can try to maintain a relatively similar bedtime and awake time, even on weekends, right? Which is key and has often been difficult for me, but it is definitely important. The body thrives often off of, or I should say, our internal biological systems thrive off of routine. And so some seasonal variation may be allowable, particularly, if your seasonal changes are quite drastic. There may be a little bit of a swing by, an hour or two for some people. So, for myself, I'm kind of forced to wake up earlier in the summers because it's so much lighter in the summers around here. And so I usually just go to bed a little bit earlier in the summers as well. However, if you want to be very consistent throughout the year and you do have these kind of large swings in the amount of daylight that you have, you can use things like darkening or blackout shades to keep your room dark to a certain time. And if that's a problem for you in the morning, as often it can be for me, where I just want to kind of sleep for a lot longer, then you can use something like a sunrise alarm clock, and that can actually stimulate. It's not going to be as good as opening up the sunshades, right, and getting fresh morning sunlight, but you can't do that while you're sleeping anyways. So this can kind of just wake you up in more of a natural way, and then you can go outside and get your morning sunlight. So that's the first one, is just maintaining a consistent sleep schedule. And the second one I kind of just briefly touched on, but it's getting natural light during the day. Right? You can use the blackout shades at night, but you want to get rid of them during the day so that you're getting plenty of, whether it be like relatively direct, say morning sunlight, or it's indirect daytime light, because your shades are open, your windows are open, and there's a lot of natural light coming into the space that you're in.
You think that there's any advantage in getting early morning light versus light later in the day?
Yeah, I think setting that circadian rhythm initially by getting morning sunlight is really, really good, because it's going to suppress that melatonin secretion, right? And it's going to help with kind of total daytime rhythm. Your body's kind of anticipating that you're going to be typically up for about 16 hours, right?
Yep.
And so by suppressing melatonin at a certain time, it's going to be better able to kind of prepare for your nighttime 16 hours later. So, while daytime light is important as well to a certain extent, that morning light might be arguably one of the most important.
Kind of it starts the clock ticking, so to speak, right? Yeah.
Yep. Number 3 would be limiting exposure to artificial light. Now, this is going to be especially blue light and especially late at night. Right. So we talked about the importance of getting sunlight in the morning. This is avoiding the most detrimental type of light, particularly when your brain is going to be most susceptible to inhibiting that melatonin secretion. Right. And so, for those that don't know, blue light stuff is fairly popular, and so it's built into most of our screens and phones, whatnot these days. And so most people have heard about the negative impacts of blue light, but just in case you haven't, the color spectrum is made up of a bunch of different colors, and blue light is in particular is really good at suppressing melatonin production. So the sun actually naturally tends to be more of a bluish hue in the morning, which is great, right? Because we want to suppress melatonin. And in the evening, the natural light turns to a more of a reddish hue. But then we go and we jump on our screen, we look at our phones, right? We watch TV or whatnot as we're trying to maybe wind down for the evening. And the light being emitted from screens is very strongly in favor of blue light. There's a lot of blue light in there unless you do some modifications to your screens. So in the evenings, you can avoid screens. You can use dimmer, warmer lights. You can use candles. Being by a fire, right? Like if you're camping, that doesn't the type of light that's being emitted from a fire doesn't seem to inhibit melatonin production in the same way that ambient or artificial lights do as well. And then for those that kind of have to be on a screen for whatever reason, if you can't really avoid it prior to bedtime, you can mitigate some of the damaging effects by using blue light blocking glasses, by changing the hue on your screen to be more reddish. Those are a step in the right direction, but the best solution is getting off of them entirely.
Yeah, no, that makes definitely a lot of sense. And about how long before bedtime do you think it's important to avoid screens as much as possible?
I generally like to say around an hour. I've got this, and I stole this, and I don't necessarily remember who it was from, but it's essentially the 3-2-1 rule, and that's no food 3 hours before bed, no liquids 2 hours before bed, and no screens 1 hour before bed. It just makes it easy to remember, and for most people, an hour without screens, and also using that as maybe like a trigger to kind of dim the other lights that you have in the area is usually enough to give your body adequate time to start producing the melatonin naturally. Many people would like to do earlier if possible, or I should say it might be more optimal to do it earlier. And one way of framing that that I've heard it called is a digital sunset. So meaning as the sun goes down, you actually start to turn off those other lights as well, right? So your screens and the artificial lights that you have. And so if you want, and so for some people, in the winter, that might be more like 5-6 o'clock, which is, pretty early for many people. But some people want what's most optimal. So I just figured I'd throw that out there.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And one thing that I do sometimes mention to my patients too, it's not just even the blue light, but sometimes depending on what we're doing online, that in and of itself can be stimulating too. And so
Very
I
true.
think that whole, and it might not directly always inhibit the melatonin secretion, but that overstimulation of the brain can also inhibit the ability to fall asleep as well. So I really like what you're saying about reducing, that digital sunset idea, reducing any entertainment media at least an hour, but maybe even ideally an hour and a half, 2 hours beforehand. So.
And it's important to have a bedtime routine. So I'll number this as number 4. So creating a relaxing bedtime routine. Now, you mentioned avoiding stimulating activities. The first one that I mentioned was reading as being a potentially beneficial bedtime routine. However, with the caveat there, obviously a lot of book material can be sort of activating and mentally stimulating. And so, there might be certain genres. I remember like in high school reading a sort of thriller suspense, and it was very hard to go to sleep, right? It was such a page turner. And so, I'm up till 2 a.m., right, reading this book because I couldn't put it down. And so when I'm talking about reading, I'm obviously talking about something that's not necessarily going to activate you. Other things could be taking a bath, practicing relaxation techniques, maybe doing some journaling, doing some deep breathing, some gentle stretching, maybe just having a conversation, with your family, with your friends. Right? Those are things we don't do as much anymore, right? But those are some great options if you're looking for things to fill that last hour before you go to bed. Sometimes I'll also just I'll listen to maybe some music or listen to a podcast. The Brain People podcast might be a great podcast to listen to as you're trying to fall asleep. Right? So. Yeah, so those are some suggestions for you.
Jonathan's soothing voice.
Number 5, you kind of briefly mentioned this, I think, as well, but limiting caffeine and stimulants. So, caffeine obviously can be found in all sorts of things: coffee, green and black teas, sodas, energy drinks. Excedrin, is another one not everybody talks about, right? If you have migraines and you're popping 2 Excedrins, you're getting 130 milligrams of caffeine. That's the equivalent of a decent cup of coffee. And so if you're doing that in the afternoons and the evenings, that can definitely impair your melatonin production, your sleep quality. And so obviously that's a little bit more of a nuanced thing because hard to sleep with migraines too. So, for each their own, but something to consider. Also, many weight loss supplements also have caffeine, but also other stimulating compounds. And so that is another thing just to consider. If you are taking those, might be worthwhile if you can to take them earlier in the day. Things like nicotine, many medications like ADHD medications, beta blockers, and certain supplements can actually both impair melatonin, but also be overly activating, and as a result, really counter the effect of melatonin.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. Any other tips as far as enhancing, optimizing melatonin?
Yeah, I'll mention just a couple more really briefly. The first one being alcohol. I think we talked about this extensively in a previous episode, I believe on insomnia. And so it promotes initial drowsiness, but it disrupts sleep quality and depth over the course of the night. And so, really, alcohol should not be used as a sleep aid. You also want to create a sleep-friendly environment, so keeping your room cool, dark, and quiet. For more specifics, I'll reference you to our previous insomnia episodes where we talk about specific numbers associated with those things. And then one that I'll just kind of briefly mention because it's free and basically side effect free as well. There's this idea called earthing or grounding. I know for many people this might sound a little bit woo-woo. It was for me as well when I first heard about it, and I'm not completely convinced of its effectiveness, but like I said, it might be worth considering for some people, especially for those with shift work or jet lag. And basically, the idea is that the Earth has a certain electromagnetic field, essentially, right? So there's an electromagnetism to it, and this is completely validated and whatnot, and so do we, and so we can actually synchronize our own internal electromagnetic field with the Earth if we touch it, right? And so you can actually test this with yourself. Using a particular device, a voltometer is what they call it, and so I've done it. Like you touch the voltometer, you touch the ground, and then your voltage goes to zero, right? And so, but the question is, does that mean anything health wise? And so the advocates for earthing say it has a host of health benefits, such as inflammation and wound healing and blood flow and sleep, is what many people suggest as well. And so there are a couple studies looking at sleep benefits. There was one that I looked at. It was particularly in those with mild Alzheimer's, and it did show a benefit for sleep. However, it was published in a not very well respected journal. It only had 12 participants, and so there was no placebo group, right? So it wasn't a particularly good study, but that tends to be the case with most of these earthing studies that I've seen, is that they have small sample size, not very well designed, and then they tend to be biased, or I should say they tend to have a conflict of interest because most of them are funded by people that produce earthing products, and so it's something to be aware of. But when I say I've flown to Hawaii, and this is very easy to do if you're flying to Hawaii, you're going to go on a beach anyways, right? But as soon as you touch ground, like go take your shoes off, go find a beach, go find some grass, and that seems to have some beneficial effect for me at least, and I've heard many anecdotes where that's been the case for other people as well.
So if you want an excuse to be like a kid and go barefoot running around, there you go.
There you go. So, and then the last thing we'll talk about, and I think you were going to mention this.
Yeah, so I was just going to ask, when it comes to considering supplementation, because some people might say, okay, well, great, all these things are good, but especially like if you're getting up there in age or you have some issues with kind of sleep and or just making sufficient melatonin, where does the role of supplementation actually come in?
I think it's good to look at all the other things that we just talked about and see if you can optimize any of those more so than what you are currently, right? And many people that are seeking melatonin as a sleep aid, they're generally the more mild cases, right? Or usually the people that you and I are treating for insomnia are usually have typically tried melatonin, right? And they're coming to us because they say that it doesn't work. that being said, melatonin supplementation has robust evidence that it does help with, particularly with sleep onset, but also with duration as well. However, there are some caveats there that we want to consider. And I know you were asking specifically about population. So, I would suggest that, if you have issues with sleep, if you've done if you've done some work towards trying to optimize natural melatonin production and secretion, using some of the lifestyle interventions that we've talked about before. I just realized I didn't mention exercise. That's pretty important as well to include as a lifestyle intervention, as well for just a whole host of things, but also helping with sleep. Then maybe some melatonin might be helpful for you, or maybe you are, like you said, kind of advancing in age. And as you're advancing in age, you're just finding it harder to both fall asleep, to stay asleep, and it's not purely, say, noise disruption or having to wake multiple times because of your bladder or whatever it might be, right? There seems to be kind of an insomnia issue developing. Then melatonin may be a good, real first line oral thing to take. And so, but this is where it gets a little bit. This is where it gets a little bit tricky, because I think so many people are taking melatonin supplements, and it's kind of an interesting backstory. But as a result of the context has led to a lot of people, in my opinion, using excessive doses of melatonin, things that are unnecessary, that may even be harmful both in the short and the long term.
So what happened with that? Like, why are people tending to take way too much?
Well, before I touch on that, let me just mention real quick, and this is according to the Sleep Foundation, but they say that the average melatonin dose among adults that are using it is roughly 5 milligrams, specifically like 4.8, and then 27.4 adults admit to using melatonin as a sleep aid. Now, they didn't specify whether that was regularly or intermittent use, but I assume that's probably intermittent use. And then 88% of adults who take melatonin say it does help them fall asleep faster. So that's a little confirmation bias. Right? Obviously, the ones that think it think it works are going to be more likely to actually continue using it. It's not to say that 88% of people that actually try it are going to get benefit from it. But for some context as to why I think a lot of people are overusing melatonin. So MIT was actually, there's a research group behind MIT that was doing a lot of the initial research for melatonin, and determining whether or not it was actually an effective modality for sleep. And they actually kind of discovered that, the optimal range for the participants of the study seemed to be somewhere between 300 micrograms, that's mcgs, up to 1 milligram. Right, that would be mg. And then they ended up figuring that range was pretty sufficient, and so they decided to go ahead and patent that particular range, right? Because they thought, okay, this seems to be optimal, and so we'll just go ahead and patent that particular range. So 300 micrograms to 1 milligram. However, it ended up getting categorized as a dietary supplement, and being relatively unregulated, other producers were able to come in and basically make dosage forms of melatonin that were outside of that particular range. And so basically all of them ended up going with higher doses than that, right? So as long as they were above the 1 milligram, they weren't infringing on the patent. And so it became very standard. And I imagine that most of these, at least initially, were cheaper, right, than going with the lower dose. And so, typical, I'd say typical Americans, but maybe the typical people, maybe in general, think that more is better, right? And so like, why would I get half a milligram when I could get 5 milligrams? Like,
right.
Why would that not do 10 times as much? And the reality is that's just not the case. A lot of the research that MIT was showing, and they did try those higher doses, they actually saw a reduced effectiveness with those higher doses and more side effects. But I did a quick search on Amazon prior to in research for this particular episode, and I saw as low as 100 micrograms and as high as 60 milligrams. So that
60
is a difference
milligrams. Wow.
of 600, right? That's like that was 60 milligrams per tablet, right?
Yeah.
So that's a 600-fold difference between the lowest and the highest dose. And I was trying to think, Dr. Binus, are there any medications, any prescription medications
Not even close.
that have not even close, right? Most are maybe in like the 2 to 5 fold range, if you will, right? So it's just insane to think that that there can't be substantial differences, right, between those doses. And so I guess the big question is, is it that big of a deal to actually take much higher doses, right? The Sleep Foundation found that the average person was taking around 5 milligrams. 10 milligrams is also a really popular dose, but I feel like the dosage has actually creeped up over the years. And so scientifically, if we get down to it, the reason why MIT ended up focusing on this 300 microgram to 1 milligram dosage range was that they found that in that range was actually where we reached complete saturation of those melatonin receptors in our brain. And why that's important, we're already going to be producing a little bit of melatonin, right? And so anything above saturation is only going to basically take longer for you to metabolize, right? Because as you metabolize some of it, then whatever's left is going to continue to bind, right? And so it can take a long while for you to actually get rid of it. But that stuff is not just, like all of it's not just going to sit there and wait around for its turn at the receptor. Some of it's going to go other places. And so that's where you're going to be more inclined to have other side effects.
So what are some of the side effects that people could potentially run into with, the excessive melatonin supplementation?
Yeah, and like I was just about to say, these side effects are generally not too catastrophic by any means, right? Melatonin supplementation is generally regarded as safe. However, it can include things like hypothermia, right? Lower basically just cold body temperature, right? It can include excessive morning grogginess. It can include hormone disruption. Remember, we talked about melatonin and its regulation of hormones. It can include depression, right? We find that as there's this relational effect between melatonin and serotonin, right? It goes to show that not always too much of a thing is a good thing, especially when the downstream effects are, okay, you've got all this excessive melatonin, now we need to convert that into other neurotransmitters and throw off those systems, and there can be sort of a downstream cascading of effects. But there are other things like headaches, dizziness, and digestive issues. Remember, we talked earlier about melatonin and its effect on gut motility, secretion, etc. Right, and so it can cause some problems there as well. But the main thing that I wanted to emphasize is, if we're trying to optimize our circadian rhythm so that our melatonin peaks, early in the evening, and then by the time we're waking up, exposing ourselves to sunlight, we're stopping that secretion. If you have all this excessive sort of outside melatonin that you took from a capsule remaining in your system, it's going to take a lot longer for you to get rid of that, for you to metabolize it. And so you're essentially delaying the suppression of your circadian rhythm to later in the morning, right? And so and then you're likely going to be kind of messing up the onset of it again, right? So you're sort of pushing it off, if you will, and so you're just throwing things off, really. All that to basically say that less is not necessarily more with melatonin, and for many people, they can get all the benefit while minimizing their risks associated with it by using lower doses, and these doses of 100 milligrams to 100 micrograms to 1 milligram so 1 milligram or below are readily available now because the patent that MIT had expired, so you can find them just about everywhere. And so it might be worth a try. At minimum, hopefully you'll find that it doesn't necessarily make things worse, and may, as I said, make things noticeably better. So Last thing I'll mention is just when to take it. And this is once again going to depend sort of on your individual use. But assuming you're not operating heavy machinery, you're not planning on driving in the evenings, you could do probably anywhere between 1 and maybe 3 hours, sort of at the most. I'm going back to that 3-2-1 rule. If you're getting rid of food or you're getting rid of liquids, kind of at the 3 or 2 hour mark before you go to bed, around that time might be a good time to go ahead and take your melatonin supplement. A lot of people just take it right when they go to bed, and really that's not going to be as effective as it could be, because it does take time for your body to absorb it and to start utilizing it. So at minimum, probably at least a half an hour to an hour before bed would be ideal. And for some people, pushing it back even further maybe even better.
Thank you. Yeah. And one thing I did want to comment too is that there are certain medications, like especially beta blockers, that actually inhibit the activity, and I'm not sure if it's activity or the actual secretion of melatonin. And so that might be one other class of individuals. If you take a beta blocker like metoprolol, atenolol, propranolol, that sort of thing, maybe not a bad idea to take a little bit of melatonin, especially if there's some sleep issues involved, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And on that note, I might just say melatonin is not innocuous, right? Or I should say, supplementing with melatonin is not innocuous. So it's a good idea, even if you don't think you need to mention it. That if you're taking over-the-counter melatonin, your provider might just shrug it off, right? Because they might say, "Oh, everybody's taking melatonin," right? But for some people, it's important to note because it can have some drug-drug interactions or can be causing problems that you may not be fully aware of.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jonathan, for this very enlightening enlightening almost sounds like the wrong word with melatonin. But it was very helpful. And I want to wish all of our listeners very sound, good sleep and the information that you got put into practice. And I bet it will make a difference in your quality of sleep and also in your overall quality of life, because as our sleep improves, so does our overall mental and physical health. And it really makes life a lot better. So thanks again, Jonathan, and take care to all of our listeners. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like and subscribe. Your engagement will help us reach more people who need encouragement. To hear more episodes, learn about our other mental health resources, or support us financially, visit thebrainpeoplepodcast.com.